it's great to be back. I think I gave a brown bag in this group around 2001. It's been a while. Yeah, well, that's right. Okay, well, it goes without saying that people differ in their performance of complex tasks in domains like chess and music, or pick any occupation you want. So very few people who take up some domain or some activity like playing an instrument reach an expert, much less an elite level of performance. So take as an example of an extreme elite, Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player to ever play the game, learned the moves of chess at the age of 5, took up the game seriously at age 8, was grandmaster at 13, world number 1 at 19, highest rating in history at 24. And at least in 2017, I'm not sure whether this is still the case, he's world number 1 in all forms of competitive chess. So the science of expertise seeks to identify factors that explain this striking variability in complex task performance in domains such as these. There are two long-standing historical perspectives on this question. The first is that experts are born, that they come into the world endowed with something that gives them an advantage for acquiring skill in some domain. Francis Galton articulated this view in Hereditary Genius, published in 1869. He said, "I have no patience with a hypothesis occasionally expressed that the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and boy and man are steady application and moral effort." Some 60 years later, John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, articulates the countervailing perspective. Experts are made. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select regardless of his talents." More recently, in the spirit of Watson, Anders Ericsson has argued that expert performance largely, if not entirely, reflects a long period of engaging in what he calls deliberate practice. And in 1993, Ericsson and colleagues publish a pivotal article laying out this deliberate practice framework. They say, "We agree that expert performance is qualitatively different from normal performance, and even that expert performers have characteristics and abilities that are qualitatively different from, or at least outside the range of those of normal adults. However, we deny that these differences are immutable, that is, due to innate talent. Only a few exceptions, most notably height, are genetically prescribed." Okay. Now, more specifically, Ericsson was arguing, as I said, that expert performance, consistently superior performance in some domain, reflects a long period of what they call deliberate practice. And deliberate practice includes, in their own words, activities that have been specially designed to improve the current level of performance. Think, for example, about an athlete working with a teacher or a coach, or a musician. And we could easily think about deliberate practice in the context of work performance. I mean, this is kind of training, which Kevin would call training. All right. Now, the study that started it all, which you'll be familiar with if you read books like Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell and The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle, was this study of elite musicians. And what they did is they recruited groups of musicians from a music academy in Berlin. And for each year that they had played their instrument, the violin in one study and the piano in the other. They asked them to estimate the number of hours per week they had engaged in practice with the goal of improving their performance. Okay? And you can see here that by the age of 20, the top groups, a group of students who were nominated by their music faculty as being the best, as well as a group of professional symphony players, had on average more than 10,000 hours of this practice alone with the goal of improving performance. And that was a couple of thousand hours more than the average for the next group. And in turn, that was a couple of thousand hours more than the average for the least accomplished group. And based on this finding, they argued that you can largely account for individual differences in performance in terms of accumulated amount of delivered practice. Kind of expanding on this view, Ericsson, who has really maintained this argument ever since, said, for example, that it's possible to account for the development of elite performance among healthy children without recourse to unique talent, genetic endowment, accepting again the innate determinants of body size. This account, based on the expert performance approach, shows that the distinctive characteristics of elite performers are adaptations to extended and intense practice activities that selectively activate dormant genes that all healthy children's DNA contain. This is really evoking John Watson, isn't it? Here's Ericsson reflecting on where he got this perspective. He said, "My own thoughts on exceptional ability were influenced by my family and education in Sweden, where views that genetic endowment limited the acquisition of superior performance among otherwise healthy individuals were discouraged." And here is Ericsson in his own voice. Let's see if this will play. If not, that's okay. Okay, maybe not. All right, no problem. Now, in the mid 2000s, this view kind of entered the popular imagination. Who has read the book Outliers? Okay. Chapter 2 is called the 10,000 Hour Rule. And in chapter 2 of this book, Gladwell describes Ericsson's research and calls 10,000 hours the magic number of true expertise. In turn, this 10,000 hour rule was the inspiration for a rap song by the same title, 10,000 Hours by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis. Anybody heard the song? Yeah. Here's how it goes. 10,000 hours felt like 10,000 hands. 10,000 hands that carry me. 10,000 hours felt like 10,000 hands. 10,000 hands that carry me. For the longest time, when I heard this song, I thought they were saying 10,000 ants. It's really weird. Like 10,000. Then I looked at the lyrics. Anyway, that in turn was the inspiration, or the theme music rather, for a Dr. Pepper commercial. Let me see if I can play this. If not, that's no big deal. There it is. Yes. Is that going to play? There we go.
You might check the line.
Let's see. Where might that be? Oh, there we go. Okay, I think that's it.
To become the next big rapper. But not many think that they can do it all on their own. Even fewer turned down every major label along the way, so they can create with their best friend. We're Macklemore and Ryan Lewis, and we're one of a kind.
10,000 ants. Okay, here was a Dilbert cartoon on the 10,000 hour rule. Studies show that it takes 10,000 hours of focused practice to become an expert in anything. According to your resume, you've only had enough database experience to be an incompetent menace. How many hours have you practiced doing interviews? I don't like where this is. This guy out in Portland, Oregon, read about the 10,000 hour rule in Gladwell's book and decided to quit his job as a commercial photographer and devote 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to becoming a professional golfer. He was taking this quite literally, that he would make it to the PGA Tour. He actually consulted with Anders Ericsson on this plan, and I'll return to him in a few minutes. There were commercial ventures that sprung up based on the idea of deliberate practice. This is Scott Miller, a clinical psychologist. He said that there is a radical egalitarianism in Ericsson's work that is earth-moving, that virtually anybody could do this if they had the time and the training and the teaching. And on his website, he makes claims like, what is widely believed, however, is not always true, flat earth phrenology, cold fusion, and innate talent. Deliberate practice Deliberate practice is the key to improving your effectiveness as a psychotherapist. Now, I think it's an interesting question to consider why this view seems to resonate so deeply. And the answer, I think, has to do with an idea that many people firmly believe in, that anyone can become anything they wish if they try hard enough. Benjamin Franklin talked about the self-made man. Horatio Alger wrote novels for young adults about impoverished boys and their rise to respectability through hard work. And these were really popular novels in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We might even think of this deliberate practice view as a sort of a scientific formulation of the American dream. But in the scientific literature, it's been controversial from the start. This is an exchange between Claude Bouchard, a giant of behavioral genetics, and Anders Ericsson in a 1993 symposium. Ericsson says, I've been trying to describe evidence that I think makes the case that practice is important to individual differences in performance. And Bouchard shoots back, the empirical facts are fine, this is great work, no one would dispute that, but you can't conclude from it that talent is unimportant. Maybe it's the case that the people who are most talented practice the most because they're successful at it. That's what he was saying. Douglas Detterman, who was the founder of the journal Intelligence, said this position advocated by Ericsson and Charnas should be called absurd environmentalism. Although superficially credible, the argument for absurd environmentalism is based on a number of serious errors, including the one I just mentioned, correlation doesn't imply causation. We'll get back to that. More recently, Gary Marcus, in a book called Guitar Zero, in which he describes his effort to learn how to play the guitar, says the psychologist Anders Ericsson went so far as to write, new research shows that outstanding performance is the product of years of deliberate practice and coaching, not of any innate talent or skill. How I wish it were true. Practice indeed does matter a lot in surprising ways, but it would be a logical error to infer from the importance of practice that talent is somehow irrelevant, as if the two were in mutual opposition. Okay, let's talk, before we proceed, about what exactly is the controversy in this area of research. Beginning with what is not controversial. Training is necessary for any person to acquire expertise. This is a play on that joke. Someone lost in New York comes up and says, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the response is practice, practice, practice. This is a jazz variation on that joke. This is to say that experts aren't literally born. Experts aren't literally born. We don't come into the world with a sort of specialized knowledge that you must have in order to, for example, play chess or golf. Notwithstanding claims like this one from the North Korean government. Kim Jong-il shot world record demolishing 38 under par 34, his first time playing golf with 5 holes in one. Or claims like, I know more about renewables than any human being on Earth. He's also claimed extraordinary expertise in everything from tax law to ISIS. He knows more about ISIS than the generals. So if you doubt this, challenge any baby to a game of chess or Donald Trump to a debate on recyclables. You'll win. Could resist. So you probably will. Okay, that's what is not controversial. In more technical terms, training has to account for within-person variability, that is, improvement, in a domain where specialized knowledge is necessary. Think about Magnus Carlsen, for example, in this within-person improvement. Okay, what's driving that? Well, it's his acquisition of skill in chess, right? Or this competing player. Okay, here's what is controversial. The claim that we can entirely or largely or even mostly explain differences across people in terms of their training history. For example, Anand versus Carlsen, both in the rate of improvement and the ultimate level of performance that they achieve. Here's the way to understand this in terms of a distinction between within-person variability and between-person variability. The point here is that the necessity of training to account for increases in performance within individuals has no direct implication for the magnitude and direction of the correlation of training with performance between individuals. Okay, so take a look at this panel. Here we have a situation where we have, within each of 3 people, we have a positive correlation between training and performance. Okay? We also have a positive correlation across those individuals in a positive correlation between performance and amount of training across those individuals. Okay? Here we have a situation where we have a positive correlation between training and performance within each of the individuals, but a negative correlation between performance and training across the individuals. So these are separable. Make sense? All right, this is just exactly what I said. Got ahead of myself there. All right. This is where the controversy is in the claims about the sources of between-person variability. And the testable claim that we focused on in our research is that individual differences in ultimate performance can largely be accounted for by differential amounts of past and current levels of practice. And through a series of primarily meta-analyses at this point, we've evaluated this claim. The major inclusion criterion is that a study includes measures of one or more activities interpretable as deliberate practice and of performance in some domain, like chess rating in chess. The definition of deliberate practice, structured activities created specifically to improve performance in a domain. This captures the only unchanging definition of deliberate practice in the literature, and arguably it's too broad. We could talk about that later. Okay, the basic approach in these meta-analyses: find as many studies that meet this criterion as we can, compute the average correlation, correct for unreliability for reasons that you all know much more than I do about, and then compute the average amount of variance explained. Essentially what we're doing here is simply asking, what is the average strength of the correlation between deliberate practice and performance? In our initial foray into this area of this literature, study published in Intelligence, we had 6 studies of chess. The criterion measure was chess rating. The measure of deliberate practice was studying chess, okay? And on average, 34% of the variance accounted for after correction for measurement error. In music, about the same, 30%. Other research finds similar estimates. This group in Germany found an average correlation of 0.61 between deliberate practice and objectively measured music achievement after correcting for unreliability. And so 37% of the variance. And 63% unexplained. Ericsson's research, similar estimates. For example, a study of ballet, they had a range of expertise from principal in an international company like the Bolshoi to a prestigious, still pretty highly ranked but less prestigious company like the Cleveland Ballet, on down to no professional position. And the average correlation, or sorry, the correlation between deliberate practice and that measure of expertise was 0.5, indicating 25% of the variance explained, and the rest unexplained and potentially explainable by other factors. What we've concluded based on this research is that deliberate practice is important as a predictor of individual differences in expertise from a statistical, a practical, and a theoretical perspective. It's just not as important as Ericsson has argued it is. What does this mean? Well, there's no reason to think that a healthy person will not benefit from deliberate practice, but people vary widely in the amount of deliberate practice it takes them to reach a given level of skill. Let me give you a couple of illustrations of this. This is a study done in Buenos Aires by my colleague Guillermo Campitelli. He recruited 90 chess players from the Buenos Aires Chess Club. They completed a survey to assess amount of deliberate practice. And the finding was that, number one, practice and chess rating correlated, 0.42. That's not trivial, nothing to sneeze at. But there was still a massive amount of variability in the amount of deliberate practice it took the players to reach a given level of skill, master status, to be exact. And here we can see this. We see a large amount of variability within skill level. Some never reached master level despite over 25,000 hours of deliberate practice. This is like me trying to get to a scratch handicap in golf. And the key here is, the key thing to note is that there is overlap in the distributions of deliberate practice across these 3 skill levels. This is based on chess ELO rating, 2200 and above, 2000 to 2200, and below 2000, okay? So there's some intermediate level players who have more practice than the average for the masters. There's some masters who have less practice than the average for the intermediates. Massive variability. Back to Dan McLaughlin as a case study. In just over 5 years, Dan accumulated 6,000 hours of deliberate practice. Notably, this is not just going to the golf course. He didn't include that. This is actually doing something to improve his performance. And he becomes a good recreational player, probably within the top 10%. His career low round, albeit not in a tournament, was 70, 200 par. That's good. Though he does struggle in tournament play. For example, in the Iceberg Open, he shot 21 over par. Excuse me. And then at 6,000 hours, he injured his back and had to stop the project. Okay, let's contrast this with Greg Norman, one of the greatest players in history. He gets his first set of golf clubs at age 15. Shortly thereafter, records a score of 108. At age 17, he reaches a scratch, 0 handicap. That's 18 months after beginning. At age 18, he's the second low amateur in the Australian Open. There are a lot of good players in Australia. Age 21, he turns pro with a negative 13 total, wins his first professional tournament, beating 2 of the best players in the world who are currently on the PGA Tour. At age 32, he reaches world number 1, and he holds that spot for 332 consecutive weeks. In short, deliberate practice is one, but not the only important piece of the expertise puzzle. So what are the other pieces of the puzzle? I'll talk just briefly about some of the things that we've been interested in, beginning with developmental factors. One big question with regard to developmental factors is, when is the optimal age to start training and to specialize? And anecdotally, there's evidence for starting as early as possible. Tiger Woods, Michaela Schifrin. Tiger Woods was hitting a golf ball on the Mike Sullivan show at age 3. Michaela Schifrin is on skis as soon as she can walk. These of course are just anecdotes. So what does the evidence suggest with respect to starting age? Well, something quite different. This is results of a study by Arne Gulick in Germany at one of the sports universities there. A study of elite athletes. He compared 83 medalists and 83 non-medalists matched on sport, age, and gender. And these are medalists in the Olympics and World Championship events. They completed a survey to assess their practice history, their starting age, their participation not only in their main sport but in other sports. The finding was that medalists specialized later than non-medalists by about a year and a half. Also, the medalists, at least in adolescence, the medalists had accumulated less practice in their main sport and more practice in another sport. And Arne thinks that there are a number of possible explanations for this. One is that you're less likely to burn out if you specialize later. Yes, AJ.
But wouldn't you expect the nature of the sport to control a lot more of the variance? So what's the meaning of this average across?
Yeah, they actually did analyses separately for different types of sports, and the trends are even for, I believe they even found this same kind of trend for like gymnastics, where
sports, I would expect a trend, but to get a number that would be meaningful across sports.
well, I think what is meaningful is maybe not necessarily the numerical estimate, but the direction. Okay, comparing the medalists and the non-medalists. You see what I mean? Okay, so the medalists are starting later on average than the non-medalists. Is that?
It's just, it's matched, it's a matched sample.
Oh, well, yes, it is a matched sample, right? Yeah, exactly. So they identified 83 medalists, and for each of the medalists, they got a non-medalist who was in the same sport, the same age, and of the same gender. I think that helps with your. Okay, we can come back to that if you want. Okay, ability factors. If you get a group of kids together and you give them training in something, or adults in the workplace, they're going to differ in the rate at which they progress and the ultimate level of performance that they achieve. In rare cases, we see prodigies. A prodigy is a child who performs at a level well above same-age peers, although not necessarily at an elite level for adults. So what are the factors, what are the ability factors that might drive these individual differences in the rate of acquiring skill and the ultimate level of performance that's achieved? There's been a bit of work on prodigies. This is an interesting place to look for clues about what types of ability factors might be important. Much of this work has been case studies. Nadia was a prodigy described in the child development literature. She actually died quite early. She started drawing at age 3, and her drawings are marked by an extraordinary realism for her age. She suffered from autism with severe learning disabilities, but had this extraordinary skill in drawing. There's been some more systematic, larger sample studies done on prodigies. Joanne Ruthsatz studied 18 prodigies, 5 in music, 8 in art, and 5 in math, and gave them the Stanford Binet with fluid reasoning knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual, spatial, and working memory subscales, and then of course a full scale IQ score. Now, here's the interesting thing, at least to me. If you look at full scale IQ, as well as fluid reasoning knowledge, quantitative reasoning, and visual spatial ability, you see a quite wide range of scores. Above average, but still a big range, from about 110, for example, for full scale IQ to 140. For working memory, 15 of 18 were above the 99th percentile, 11 of 18 were above the 99.9 percentile. So maybe working memory is something that we need to study in relation to expert performance. And we've done some of that work. Working memory, you can think of it as the ability to hold some information in the focus of your attention over a relatively short period of time. It's measured by tasks like these, where you have interleaved processing and storage tasks, like you solve a series of arithmetic equations, then you remember a letter that follows each, and after a recall prompt, you try to remember each of the letters. So you're holding some information in mind while your attention is intermittently drawn away. In a 2010 study, a colleague and I looked at working memory and deliberate practice in relation to sight reading performance. Sight reading in music is playing a piece of music without preparation. And we found that deliberate practice accounted for a large amount of the variance, 45%, but working memory added 7% above and beyond working memory. Now, ordinarily, in most crowds, I'll get 7%, that's like nothing. And I don't think I have to make the case that 7% is nothing in this crowd. Okay, how might ability factors be involved in acquiring expertise, both directly and indirectly? This comes straight from the job performance literature. Basic abilities leading to the acquisition of domain-specific knowledge in turn predicting domain-specific performance. There also might be direct effects of basic abilities on domain-specific performance. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Actually, will I? Oh, I took that slide out. So think about performing as a direct effect. Think about performing in some task, and all of a sudden the conditions of the task change, and you have to rethink how you're going about it. that might be a situation where there's a direct effect that's not mediated through your prior knowledge. I wanted to mention this briefly, particularly for you all. There's this idea in the expertise literature that, okay, yeah, cognitive ability, including things like working memory, yeah, maybe it's important initially in skill acquisition, but as you train and you become more experienced, eventually it drops out as a predictor of performance. And this has become kind of like a mantra in the expertise literature. It's accepted as the truth. I call this the vanishing validity myth because, in fact, when, for example, you look at the job performance literature, that's not what it looks like to me, at least. Recently, in a chapter with my grad student Alex Burgoyne and Fred Oswald, we reviewed all of the available evidence for this hypothesis that the validity of cognitive ability decreases as a function of job training and experience. And basically what we found is no consistent support for this. And if you look in the job performance literature, yeah, maybe validity, in some cases it drops a little bit initially, but it's still substantial after many years of job experience. We got our hands on a large sample from the Joint Service Job Performance Measurement and Listed Standards Project, which maybe you all know about. And we were able to look at the correlation between ASVAB scores and hands-on job performance as a function of amount of job experience for military jobs. And there were about 30 jobs, I think, in this data set. And we looked at it at kind of a course and a finer grain level. 0 to 12, 13 to 24, 25 to 36, and 37 plus months on the job. So you can see that from year 1 to year 2, there's a bit of a drop, 0.4 to maybe 0.25, and then thereafter it levels off at about 0.25. And you can see here that when we go out to more job experience, the estimate's less precise out here, but it's not going to 0. All right. Okay. That's one additional piece of the puzzle. Dispositional factors are important to consider as well. Elite performers in various domains will have an almost, in some cases, pathological seeming commitment to what they do. Marie Curie often worked in her lab past midnight, and this was after winning her first Nobel Prize. Ellen Winter has called this sort of commitment to a domain a rage to master, focusing mainly on children in her work, but I think it's applicable to adults. She said they have a powerful interest in the area or domain in which they have high ability, mathematics, say, or art, and they can readily focus so intently on work in this domain that they lose sense of the outside world. It sounds almost like a highly domain-specific obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. There are dispositional factors of this sort that I think might predispose people to committing themselves to deliberate practice. In this one study with Angela Duckworth, Ericsson measured grit. This is persistence towards long-term goals. Deliberate practice for spelling, like memorizing words, word lists. And then they looked at spelling performance in a national spelling bee. And so what they found is that grit positively predicted deliberate practice. Grit might be just conscientiousness. I know what you all are thinking. And then in turn, deliberate practice positively predicted spelling performance. Now, I think that other dispositional factors can have a direct effect on performance. For example, emotional regulation, the ability to perform under pressure. Think about a piano solo before a a packed crowd at Carnegie Hall. So maybe there's some kind of dispositional factor that affects performance directly. There's emerging evidence from twin studies that points to a genetic contribution to variation in expertise. I'll tell you about one of my favorites. This is done in Great Britain. 7,752 twins complete a draw person test as well as a test of general intelligence. And the draw person test is scored from 0 to 12 based on the presence and correct number of features like head, eyes, nose, and mouth. The child is simply asked to draw a person. And what's kind of adorable and cool here is that the monozygotic twins, they're more similar to each other than the dizygotic twins, both if they're good or bad. So they're really bad, and they're bad in the same ways. Whereas the dizygotic twins are good or bad in less similar ways. So the MZ correlation is 0.55, the DZ correlation is 0.39. Double the difference is a rough and ready estimate of heritability. I think that's about 32%. Now, what we've been looking at, when I say we, some colleagues who are behavioral geneticists, is the heritability not only of performance measures, but also practice. We analyzed data from the National Merit Twins Study of 1962, 800 twin pairs identified from 400,000 high school juniors taking the SAT. And these twins were given a large survey of interests, attitudes, preferences, accomplishments, and so on. And we found a heritability of 26% for music accomplishment, as indexed by things like winning an award in a music competition, a local or regional or a national music competition, things of this sort. And then 38% for self-reported music practice. Okay? In Sweden, my colleagues Frederick Uhlin and Miriam Mosing, in a much larger sample, they replicated this. They had 2,569 full twin pairs. Heritability of lifetime hours of music practice was on average about 50%, 41% for males, 69% for females. Now, in the expertise literature, this is kind of a head scratcher because, wait, how could practice be heritable, right? That doesn't compute. It's a purely environmental variable. But this is readily explained in terms of the concept of gene-environment correlation. This is the idea that the environments that we seek out and create for ourselves are in part influenced by our genes. And so that's how you explain this sort of genetic effect on variation in music practice. A complete account of the factors that underlie variation in expertise will, of course, have to also include task and situational factors. Think about performing under highly competitive conditions, or domains where they're highly speeded, where the rate of information is extremely high. Where from here? Well, we need to develop multifactorial models of expertise that take into account all potentially relevant explanatory constructs, not just training. And this is exactly what we're trying to do. This is a framework that we described in a Cycle paper. We call it the multifactorial gene-environment interaction model. And basically, you can see here that expertise is influenced by multiple factors that may have both direct and indirect effects on expertise, and also interactive effects. So ability might moderate the impact of domain-specific knowledge on expertise. as might task and situational factors. And critically, both genetic and environmental influences are assumed to operate throughout this model. Dean Simonton kind of captured where we hope to eventually get in this effort to understand expertise as a multifactorial outcome. He said that it's extremely likely that environmental factors, including deliberate practice, account for far more variance in performance than does innate capacity in every salient talent domain. Even so, psychology must endeavor to identify all of the significant causal factors behind exceptional performance rather than merely rest content with whatever factor happens to account for the most variance. I think that we can use knowledge from this research to advance practice. We can give people better information about their potential if they want it. And potentially we can design training to maximize that potential. Thanks and some acknowledgments. Guillermo Campitelli and Brooke McNamara, two primary collaborators. The group at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, some people here at Michigan State. There's Fred Oswald, who many of you know, at Rice. And be happy to take a few questions. I think we have some time. Yes.
Do any of these studies on experts looking at deliberate practice account for the differences in deliberate practices? Because there's a lot of ways to practice that are efficient and inefficient, such as even taking breaks is more efficient than the amount of hours you do.
Yeah.
Space it out.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard with self-report type measures. And I think that's really one of the big limitations of this whole area of research. We've tried to do this sort of thing at a bit of a coarser level. We've looked at group versus individual practice. We've also looked at whether the estimates vary depending on the type of criterion measure, whether it's an objective one or, say, membership on a team. And the estimates are really pretty similar. One thing that's, I think, kind of fascinating is that in some of these studies we have retrospectively self-reported practice. That's the approach that Ericsson used. Think back to when you were 7 and how much did you practice? I mean, there are reasons to think that those estimates might not be so accurate. There are some studies in our meta-analyses that have used a log method, and the estimates of the correlations are much lower when you have logged practice instead of retrospectively estimated practice. But back to your point, I think that really where the research needs to go, and this is what Rob and I have talked a little bit about, is experimental studies. So let's experimentally manipulate how people have their attention focused in practice, or let's experimentally manipulate the spacing of practice. These correlational studies where we have surveys and people are, estimating their practice, I don't think we can get at that very well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine there's genetic influences on how well you're able to practice or techniques for
which
information as well.
Yes, which I think is essentially another way of saying that ability is important, right? Yeah. All right, more questions? Yes, Kevin.
So, my first question is, you've been very kind to Ericsson. So,
Right.
what's his position
Oh.
today?
Oh, that's funny you should ask. Let's see, I just might. How do I get to the removable drive?
Go to files.
Oops.
The folder at the bottom.
Oh, there we go.
On the left.
There you go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what does Ericsson say? Well, he says that we, let me get to it. He claims that we haven't adhered to the original definition of deliberate practice, and the studies we've included in our meta-analysis violate his criteria for deliberate practice. Well, his criteria have changed. Okay, so let me just, he rejects, in a commentary that he wrote on our meta-analysis, he rejects studies for violating his criteria for deliberate practice that he once used to argue for the importance of deliberate practice. Here, let me just show you a couple of slides. Here's the definition of deliberate practice. For the design of deliberate practice, a teacher is required, is typically or often involved, is not required. Okay, all over the place. So let me show you this as an example of him rejecting evidence that he's in the past used. Okay, so he rejected this study, one of his own studies, because there's no record of a teacher coach supervising all or most of practice. However, in the report of the study, he and his colleagues stated, in short, the present study revealed that the single major factor contributing to professional level dart playing is deliberate practice. They labeled a variable deliberate practice. He rejected this study in his commentary on our meta-analysis in the same year in which he used the study to argue for deliberate practice. I think this is a problem.
So,
What's that?
you pointed this out, right? So
Yes.
What's his perspective?
He'll say, he'll say, I'll give you an example of what he says. He plays word games. So, for example, here's one. So he's also, like here, he said, there are activities meeting the criteria for deliberate practice in Scrabble, okay? And here he's saying that Scrabble players can't engage in deliberate practice. So what he says, I didn't mean all the criteria. I meant some of the criteria. That's the nature.
So he's protecting his.
Yeah.
I just thought the grad student should hear
Yeah.
that story, because I think it's an interesting one, right? You kind of get tied into your own stuff.
Yeah, you do.
It's
You
hard-
get tied
it's
in.
hard to get out of it, right?
And I tell you,
It's
it's
sort of gotten worse. It's kind of gotten worse because he's trying to refute things that he's actually already said before.
right.
So.
And then you get into this mess,
Yeah.
and people like me come along and, produce a presentation like this that I don't mean to be mean, but it's important to point this stuff out because it stalls the field.
So I agree with Nathan, though, that it seems to me the big issue is just defining deliberate practice, measuring it in ways like you're talking about. Because we already know from the learning literature, certain things tend to lead to more learning than not, right? And so that would be an
Yeah.
area also to look at, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
deliberate
here's the
practice
thing.
means so many different things.
Right. And I'll get you in just a second, Courtney. I think it's important to note here that this deliberate practice concept, I think, is a valuable one. It makes a lot of sense to think about the most effective conditions for acquiring skill and maximizing performance. And I think that the positive aspects of this deliberate practice view really get diluted when when Ericsson is varying the definition of deliberate practice and he's rejecting evidence that he previously used to argue for that. I think that is unfortunate. Courtney.
Is there room for consideration of interest, or some people might call it passion, or
Yeah.
how would you like something within deliberate practice
Yes.
and leading to expertise?
Yes. In fact, Fred Oswald and my graduate student just wrote a chapter for Chris's book on interest on this very topic, and we talk about interest as a predictor of one's willingness to engage in deliberate practice, sustaining deliberate practice in what particular domain that you choose. And yeah, I think that this is an example of what we would call in the framework I just described a dispositional type factor, and there needs to be more work on that. Were there specific ways that you were thinking that interest might bear on expertise?
No, I think I was thinking about in the work domain.
Yeah.
There could be, it's hard to call it deliberate practice, but some of it might be like your job evaluations. And
Yeah.
you might try to do that, but if you don't like
Ah.
what you're doing, then it
Oh, yeah.
has no bearing
Yeah.
on you being
Right.
more effective.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So affecting the intensity of your training. So maybe it impacts not only what type of domain you take up, but also kind of back to the point about trying to look at more specific aspects of deliberate practice. It might affect how your attention is allocated during training activities and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's a good point. Jenna.
Thanks. So how does practice matter for just the creative aspects of performance? Does it seem
Yeah.
similar?
Yeah. Well,
Being able to draw well versus drawing something not?
Yes. Ericsson has actually tried to argue that you can explain creative achievement and creative performance in terms of deliberate practice. I think that is a wide open empirical question. And what I've been thinking about is a study where we, in the same sample in some domain like music, we actually have measures both of their expertise and of their creativity. And we see how highly they're related. And we also see whether or not different sorts of factors impact. Imagine an outcome, a second outcome variable here. And I think that the patterns of prediction are going to be different. What would be your thoughts on?
Yeah, I think it would. And
Yeah.
they're right. Wouldn't interests matter or
Yeah.
more individual difference variables?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about like improvisational jazz or something. Now this is kind of an interesting example because my grad student who is a musician tells me that improvisational jazz, let's say, as an example of a more creative musical activity, he says it's not in fact as improvisational as it seems. So I wonder if that's true with other types of creativity. Think about scientific creativity. I mean, you have to have something to work with. It doesn't come out of anywhere. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Sergio.
So I'm interested in the developmental trajectory of expertise.
Yeah.
I think of prodigies at very early ages. It's very mechanical skills that they're able to like be experts on. So it's like learning piano or
Yeah.
maybe like golf. Where
Yeah.
like, there's no experts on analyzing Shakespeare when you're like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Because you have to develop those higher order kind of factors.
Right.
So are
Knowledge, like a huge amount of knowledge.
So are there like maybe, is there a difference on maybe the importance of deliberate practice once you hit that kind of higher order development milestone, like metacognitive skills, you're able to evaluate performance, like evaluate goals better?
Yeah, so maybe deliberate practice becomes less important, you think?
Maybe.
Well, okay, a little bit relevant to this, we've actually looked at elite versus sub-elite, like Olympic level versus merely national level players. And the correlations of practice with performance actually are pretty small at that really high level. There's still a range. It's not completely restricted a range. There's still a range. So I wonder whether, maybe it's the case that at some point you're not getting anything more out of deliberate practice. It's other sorts of things that are coming online that are critical. Okay.
time, so thank you very much.
Yeah.